This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. Last October, an article went viral. It was called "Is Having a Boyfriend Embarrassing Now?" by Chanté Joseph. It's about how some young women have begun to find relationships rather embarrassing to tell their friends about, and how some are getting reluctant to fall in love at all. On a completely different note, last week I read an article by Substacker Cartoons Hate Her about how in certain portions of the manosphere, as it's now become known, it is a social cost to be in a happy relationship. If having a boyfriend is embarrassing in some places, then it seems like having a girlfriend is embarrassing in others. So all of this begs the question, is love embarrassing now? And is this anything new? My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Boyfriends, girlfriends, and shame. Let's just go through these two articles first so we're all on the same page. We won't cover everything in there because they're both pretty substantial, but we'll cover a fair amount of it. The first article's thesis can be roughly summed up in the following quotation from it. To me, the phenomenon of young women finding their boyfriends embarrassing feels like the result of women wanting to straddle two worlds. One where they can receive the social benefits of having a partner, but also not appear so boyfriend-obsessed that they come across quite culturally loser-ish. Chanté Joseph takes a couple of different angles on this phenomenon. First, she discusses that there just is a newfound freedom, historically speaking, for women over the past few generations, such that they no longer need a partner for economic or social reasons. There's no longer the same cost to being, say, a single woman in her 40s economically because there's plenty of employment opportunity, nor is it looked down upon as cripplingly shameful societally, or at least not as often. However, that doesn't by itself account for having a boyfriend being specifically embarrassing. It just accounts for it being one option among many. So there are two further factors that she discusses. The first is that if you display your partner, especially online, and thus are publicly seen to be in a relationship, then you might look a bit silly if the relationship breaks down later down the line. Take this statement from a woman Joseph interviewed. I was in a relationship for 12 years and never once posted him or talked about him online. We broke up recently, and I don't think I will ever post a man, says Nikki, 38. Even though I am a romantic, I still feel like men will embarrass you even 12 years in, so claiming them feels so lame. In effect, there is something quite vulnerable about being publicly in love, but knowing that things could end, and then everyone who knew about your love would presumably infer that you were badly hurt. Joseph argues that people are more scared of being seen as vulnerable due to their partner than they used to be, and that there is an accompanying shame about this. The other main factor that she identifies is that other young women might quietly, or sometimes loudly, condemn the decision to have a boyfriend. In some cases, her and her interviewees suggest this might be simple jealousy. At other times, they discuss how some people perceive it as boring to have a boyfriend. It's considered unadventurous or dull. From an audience perspective, and considering that she does interview some influencers in her article, I think this is relevant, to publicly have a relationship is, in effect, to constrain the number of scenarios that the audience can picture the influencer in. It limits the imagined interactions that the audience can picture. And as I said, this concern seems basically limited to public figures or social media influencers. But at the same time, as more and more of us are encouraged to have some kind of public profile, however minor, this may be a more widely relevant concern than it used to be. Now, when this article was first published, parts of the internet went into a bit of an uproar about it for a couple of weeks, seeing it as largely a gendered thing. People were saying that young women in particular now found boyfriends embarrassing. But when I was watching all this go down, I couldn't help but think that I don't think this phenomenon is limited to young women at all, and that actually there are a sizable proportion of young men who also have come to see having a partner as deeply embarrassing. I wasn't quite sure how to put this until I came across an article by the Substacker Cartoons Hate Her called "The Rise of the High Five Sexuals." There, she argues that for a sizable number of young men, it has become cooler almost to appear to be aloof to women entirely than to actually fall in love with one and partner up, or even achieve some kind of caricatured idea of sexual success. Obviously, just like the young women finding boyfriends embarrassing, this is almost certainly just a loud minority of the population rather than a big majority of it. This phenomenon reaches its extreme in tweets like this one from Andrew Tate, where he declares that having a girlfriend is gay. Obviously, this is only anecdotal, but I have actually met a few men who have this general attitude towards relationships, and usually not in the same aggressive way that Tate puts it. For instance, someone I once knew suffered from really quite awful self-esteem issues. He considered himself terribly ugly and thus was convinced that no woman would ever want him. He wasn't hateful or nasty, he was just really down on himself. And one time we were talking, and he said something to me that I'll paraphrase for you now because it's been a long time, but it went roughly like this. I am really ashamed of being attracted to women. It feels embarrassing that so many people have so much control over how I think about myself. If a woman were to compliment me, that could make my day. And if I get rejected, it can ruin my week. I feel so weak and so pathetic. And Cartoons Hate Her points out that for a certain subset of young men, and especially quite online young men, they reinforce one another's shame and embarrassment at being attracted to the opposite sex. It's slowly seen as what many of them call a low-status thing to have. Her article could just as well have been titled, "Is Having a Girlfriend Embarrassing Now?" I think that both of these articles are astute in their own way, and I certainly found them very interesting. The main critique that they both understandably received is that their more extreme observations only really apply to a really quite tiny proportion of both men and women. However, I do think we can see more mundane versions of this embarrassment view of love in everyday life. For instance, how often have you seen a group of otherwise perfectly normal young men rib another young man for spending too much time with his girlfriend or being whipped? How often have you seen a young woman being mocked for placing too much emphasis on what the men that she fancies think of her? It's not that unusual to see couples mocked for seemingly being too in love. Although very few people actually find relationships themselves a source of deep social shame, there is a kind of undercurrent of embarrassment to love as it exists today that I think's quite hard to deny. But sometimes when we observe something happening around us, it's very tempting to infer that it is something peculiar to our age, or that it is caused by something peculiar to our age. This can be entirely appropriate if we're examining, say, the effects of the internet, since that is a genuinely new invention that has changed huge swaths of the world. However, I want to make the case that love's embarrassment isn't a recent development at all, nor is it related or restricted to one gender. Instead, these articles are just the latest in an extraordinarily long line of laments over the embarrassing phenomenon of falling in love. And that, in fact, I think as long as we continue to be locked into a particular idea of what it means to be a dignified, rounded adult human being, we will continue to find love almost unbearably embarrassing to the end of time. So, to place these articles in a broader historical context, let's take a jaunt through the long story of people being embarrassed that they fancy someone. But before moving on, I just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you'll know it can be a real hassle. First, you have to find a domain name and then construct the entire thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you're messing it up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, but actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They take all of that complexity and compress it into a single platform, using ready-made templates to take all of that complication and pain out of website building. Their block-based fluid engine editing system is also so easy to use and makes it simple to integrate anything you want into your website without having to master some elaborate coding language. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. 2. Love has always been embarrassing. One of my favorite books on love is by the philosopher Simon May, and it's essentially a history of the concept, going all the way back to ancient Greece and ending up in the 20th century with Marcel Proust. And one of the things that I noticed when reading May's book is that love being embarrassing is a theme that's been present in our earliest literature on the subject. Take this passage from Plato's Symposium, where Alcibiades is talking about the embarrassing effects that Socrates has on him. This man has often brought me to such a state that I have felt as if I could hardly endure the life I'm leading. This, Socrates, you will admit. And I'm conscious that if I do not shut my ears against him and fly as from the voice of the siren, my fate would be like that of others. He would transfix me, and I would grow old sitting at his feet. For he makes me confess that I ought not to live as I do, neglecting the wants of my own soul and busying myself with the concerns of the Athenians. So I hold my ears and tear myself away from him. And he is the only person who ever made me ashamed, which you might think not to be in my nature, and there is no one else who does the same. Alcibiades is talking about how much Socrates' words and opinions hold sway with him, and then says that this makes him feel ashamed. Part of this is that Socrates is an astute critic and is certainly not afraid to criticize Alcibiades' actions. But it also comments on Alcibiades' own romantic feelings towards Socrates. Socrates himself says that he totally loses his reason when he is significantly attracted to someone, which, in the context of his ethical philosophy, which prioritizes the rational part of our soul above its appetitive part, this is a pretty embarrassing thing to admit. So, over 2,000 years ago, we already see the link between love and powerful erotic attraction and embarrassment. And this is not an isolated incident even in the ancient world either. May discusses the Roman poet Lucretius, who writes the following: "They squash the body they sought until it squeals, and often their teeth make a gash on the lips in the course of affixing a kiss, which is hardly pure pleasure. They are indeed rather provoked to injure the object, whatever it is, which causes this onset of lunacy." In classic Epicurean fashion, Lucretius is condemning the kinds of attachment that being in love with someone brings with it. And although he's not talking about his own attachments, and although he himself is not totally anti-marriage and anti-relationships, he clearly sees that there's something slightly undignified in romantic and erotic attraction. He calls it a lunacy. And to take an ancient example from a female writer, the Greek poet Sappho refers to her own heart as mad in her poetry, and says the following about her love: "And what excites my mind, your laughter glittering. So when I see you for a moment, my voice goes, my tongue freezes. Fire, delicate fire in the flesh. Blind, stunned, the sound of thunder in my ears. Shivering with sweat, cold tremors over the skin. I turn the color of dead grass, and I'm an inch from dying." This seems to me to be a perfect portrait of the embarrassing anxiety caused by Sappho's attraction to her beloved. So, far from this being limited to a particular gender, it seems that for men and women throughout history, love has been considered a rather embarrassing sore point, especially at the point where they're not sure whether it will be reciprocated or fulfilled. Moving forward from the ancient world to the 12th and 13th centuries, May discusses the passionate romances of the troubadours. Such men saw love as ennobling, and we might think that this serves as a potential counterpoint to this link between love and embarrassment. Take the following from troubadour Griand Ricoeur. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I've given it my best shot. "Thus, love is a school of valor, for no man is so stupid, but, provided he love guides him to valorous port." However, even though the troubadours seem to valorize these passionate emotions in love, they nonetheless also recognized the compromising vulnerability of the lover. Take this passage, also quoted by May. "For joy of her a sick man can be cured, and from her anger a healthy man can die, and a wise man go mad, and a handsome man lose his good looks, and the most courtly one become a boor, and the totally boorish one turn courtly." There is a sense among these authors that to love is to lose control of yourself and to give extreme influence over you to your beloved. And so again, we see the motif of love sending someone mad, a state that is, at the very least, societally unseemly. To give a more recent example, Simone de Beauvoir talks at length as to the embarrassing effects of love and romance on the women of her time. Her figure of the woman in love is described as sort of delusional, paranoid, and worshipping. And although de Beauvoir is sympathetic and sees this as largely a result of a woman's diminished social opportunities, it is nonetheless an embarrassing portrait of what experiencing love is like. We could reflect on the amount of tormented shame love causes Cathy in Wuthering Heights, or Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Dorothy Tenov's book Love and Limerence goes even further, with many of her interviewees, both men and women, openly declaring that they were deeply embarrassed or ashamed by either their love or how their love caused them to act. Clearly, the embarrassment caused by love, at least historically, has been shared by the sexes and stretches right back to ancient history. To understand why love is so embarrassing in this way, I suggest we look at Anne Carson's pretty remarkable essay, Eros the Bittersweet. In theory, her topic is just the notion of erotic love in some forms of ancient Greek poetry, but in practice, she ventures far, far beyond this, and effectively ends up giving one of the most profound philosophical analyses of love itself. Among a host of other incredibly insightful ideas, Carson talks about the inherent wounding vulnerability that comes with being in love. She often discusses the impact of love as something like a violation. This is still clear in our modern ways of discussing the emotion. We think about being struck by love or having our heart pierced by it. We talk of falling in love, not willingly jumping into love. That is, we tend to recognize love as a powerful force that comes at us from outside and sort of wrenches hold of us, not unlike a psychological illness or an affliction. In almost all other cases, this kind of sudden subversion of our agency is considered compromising, and the embarrassment associated with love is, I think, in many ways, just a continuation of this broader theme. What we have here, in effect, is a very significant tension at the heart of our value system. On the one hand, we consider love itself to be a good thing. Indeed, for many of us, it is intrinsically desirable and constitutes one of life's greatest pleasures and sources of fulfillment. But on the other hand, we also have a long tradition of prizing rationality, objectivity, and independence, and the feeling of being in love runs pretty directly counter to these. Considering this, it's no wonder that we feel embarrassed about the particulars and peculiarities of our love, while at the same time praising love in the abstract. This is just a sort of paradox in our conception of the good life. Put a pin in this idea, as it will be the main theme of our next section. I don't think it helps that we often take a deeply idealized picture of love and call that real love, while implicitly denigrating other kinds of love that might not totally live up to that picture. Sometimes this stretches to the idea that if we ever feel anxious or nervous in our affectionate attachments, that is a clear sign that those attachments are unhealthy. But if this is the case, I just think the number of truly healthy lovers must be few and far between. It also turns love into yet another source of shame, since if we're anything other than constantly ecstatic in our own loves, then we're told that this is a defect of either us or the lover or both. And that's a pretty good recipe for embarrassment. I think this goes doubly so when we are unsure whether our already quite embarrassing love will be reciprocated, or if it seems like it's currently being reciprocated, whether that reciprocation will continue. I want you to think back to the last time that you had your heart completely shattered. Amongst all the general experiences of upset, there's also the accompanying embarrassment that goes along with the realization that you cared about someone else far more than they cared about you. We tend to find even platonic asymmetries of care rather embarrassing, such as when we find ourselves the only person in a platonic friendship who ever makes plans or reaches out. So this will be even more pronounced in the romantic sphere, where the emotional stakes just tend to be much, much higher, and as we'll see in the next section, we are much more prone to irrationality and extreme outbursts of emotion. If you need even more convincing of this, we can just reflect on the shyness that we often feel in the presence of the person that we love, yet also someone who we're not sure loves us in return, or loves us as much as we love them. We all know the kind of tongue-tied, red-cheeked fool we can turn into under such circumstances. And I don't know another word for that other than embarrassment. So I think these two articles are probably correct in identifying that having a boyfriend or having a girlfriend does sometimes come with a kind of accompanying embarrassment. They may even be right that this has become more pronounced in recent years. I'm sure that, as with any historical development, it will have changed its presentation slightly. But I don't think that there is a sharp discontinuity between a time in the past that we found love totally unembarrassing and the present day where love has suddenly become embarrassing. Instead, I think we see that embarrassment has always been a key thread in the Western literature around love and the concept we have of love, because it's just an emotion that makes us deeply, fundamentally vulnerable, and vulnerability of this kind is embarrassing in our context. We even see very old causes of emotional embarrassment from this long history of romantic literature in these now popular articles. In Joseph's article, she stresses that the possibility that the relationship might come to an end is a key factor in why having a boyfriend is embarrassing now. But this is a modern variant on the embarrassment felt by any lover should their love not be reciprocated. It is all over Sappho's poetry. Sure, we now live in the context of serial monogamy, so it manifests in a slightly different way. But it is fundamentally the same sequence of emotions, just translated into a different cultural context. So I think all of this really begs a much deeper question. Is it a good thing that such a prized and central human emotion, one of the pillars of many people's feeling of fulfillment in life, is considered embarrassing and has been considered embarrassing for many hundreds and perhaps thousands of years? Doesn't this suggest that we might want to change something about either the way we approach love or the way we approach the rest of our value system? I think that it might do. And in order to explain this, I want to discuss the fixation that many of us have on independence. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. The independence obsession. In many ways, independence can be a fantastic thing. Having the power to enact your will on the world without relying on someone else is sort of what agency often feels like, and people who feel they have agency tend to be a lot happier than those who are mired in helplessness. In healthy doses, I think that the aim of being a roughly independent adult is pretty noble and is pretty achievable for most people. However, independence is a vague term. It can mean anything from being able to fend for yourself in a normal life to never needing or desiring anyone else ever. And I fear that we've gone too far towards the latter end of this spectrum, and that this might be behind much of our feeling that love is so very embarrassing. When I talk about the independence obsession, I'm actually referring to a loose collection of ideals that are all centered around being detached and rational and, well, independent at all times. We might also throw in things like being objective or being emotionally controlled or being extremely considered in your actions. And it's not like I'm against any of these things. I think it's very good to be able to look at things in a cool, detached way and to not let your emotions carry you off at any given moment. But when these are all put together, made an ideal and made an end in themselves, and also applied indiscriminately in all contexts, I think that it can give us a rather one-dimensional picture of what a fulfilled human life looks like, and moreover, exiles some of our most profound experiences to a shameful corner, including the experience of being in love. In short, if what it means to be a respectable human is to be invulnerable and to be independent, then it's just incompatible with how many, if not most people, experience passionate love. If we think back to those declarations of love's shame and embarrassment from the last section, they were more or less all to do with the ways those authors or characters felt like they were being made vulnerable by love, and how this vulnerability was the source of shame. So it wasn't necessarily the love itself, it was the way in which that love clashed with this pre-existing independence ideal. Obviously, things are much more complicated than that. It isn't like we've had one ideal of what it means to be a respectable, independent adult for the past 2 millennia. I just think it's useful to have a rough label for this general valorization of emotional implacability and the corresponding denigration of vulnerability. Not necessarily that vulnerability is outright explicitly condemned, but just that it fails to live up to this ideal. And love really is vulnerable in the oldest sense of the term. The word vulnerable is derived from the Latin word vulnus, meaning wound. And anyone who's been in love knows that it opens you up to a pretty significant wounding. Erotic love also dispenses with any illusion that we are totally rational creatures who can be pleasantly detached from the reality around us at all times. Carson talks about the paradoxical nature of love, how it involves real pleasure mixed with real pain. We sometimes talk about loving someone so much it hurts, or that you can ache for someone you really care about. Carson's book is even called Eros the Bittersweet, and she emphasizes Sappho's use of the word glucuprokon, or joy-bitterness, as a description for love. In many of the passages we looked at, love is analogized to a kind of madness, and such states betray not only the influence that the beloved has on us, and thus our dependence on them, but also our failure to live up to the rationality that this ideal prescribes. And even this is not the most irrational part of love. Carson observes that strong erotic love often comes from a place of felt lack. At the same time as we develop this strong desire for the beloved, we are almost in the same movement, alerted to the hole within ourselves that they would fill. But at least in a significant minority of cases, we will actively place barriers in between ourselves and our beloved in order to extend our desire for them. So not only do we suffer in love, but many of us find that peculiar kind of maddening suffering deeply energizing, and we will will it to continue. It's part of why someone being slightly unavailable will often both dismay us, but also thrill us. As pointed out by Dorothy Tenov, obstacles in love both cause us to suffer and inflame our desire further, because at some level, the desire itself is exciting and rewarding. This is, to anyone in a sane or sound state of mind, complete and utter madness. And yet, it's far from uncommon in love, and even stable couples often enact mini versions of this cycle. The relationship therapist Esther Perel often observes that long-term couples sometimes reignite desire specifically by creating the right balance of closeness and separation between the two of them. For her, maintaining passionate love over time often doesn't just involve recognizing this paradoxical structure, though that's part of it. It actually involves somewhat embracing it and harnessing it. But again, to own up to this irrationality is to admit that we're falling short of this independence ideal, and thus it's embarrassing. Additionally, part of the independence obsession is the valorization of freedom and possibility, and this too flies in the face of love and its attendant devotional aspects. This is manifest in Shante Joseph's article when she says that those in relationships are seen as boring. When someone's in a relationship, they have taken on a set of responsibilities that limit them in a variety of ways. To that extent, even if they're not dependent on their partner in the sense of emotionally reliant, or don't appear to be so, they are not as free to do what they want. They are constrained. And constraint is dependence in the sense of limitation. There is one extra element to this that I think might help explain why love's embarrassment has resurfaced as a talking point, specifically in recent years. Because for a small but vocal minority of Gen Z, the opposite sex has become something more engaged with in theory than in practice. This is very easy to overstate. I don't want to be an old man shaking his fist at those darn kids. I am Gen Z, after all. But there are communities of some very online people who are loudly nihilistic about love. They go beyond merely pointing out some of the downsides of romance and argue that romantic happiness itself is a lie, either for them in particular or for everyone in general. And if you believe this hopeless framing, or even just have this vague cynicism out there in the zeitgeist, the embarrassment of falling in love becomes even more pronounced, because the subjective estimation of success is much lower. Sure, it can be a source of embarrassment to be really into your partner, because that does make you vulnerable and other people might take the piss. But it's far more embarrassing to pine after someone and something that you think you can never attain, or that you doubt you will ever attain. To quote the singer Chapel Roan, "It's fine, it's cool, you can say that we are nothing, but you know the truth, and guess I'm the fool, with her arms out like an angel through the car sunroof." To long for the unachievable is to be the fool in this stanza. And for some sections of Gen Z, love itself becomes a foolish game. This too is by no means unprecedented. Alcibiades' speech in the Symposium is predicated on the idea that Socrates does not and will not love him back. But before recently, we've not been able to broadcast our hopelessness so far and wide. And so there wasn't the same set of noisy people waiting to jeer at anyone who loved and lost because they considered them foolish for ever loving in the first place. And I wanted to frame this in terms of a more general independence obsession, because this attitude where vulnerability is connected to foolishness is by no means limited to romance. It stretches to almost every kind of interpersonal risk. Take trust, for example, just plain old non-romantic trust. When someone trusts the wrong person, we say that they've been made a fool of, or in the UK, taken for a mug. We implicitly frame being trusting as, in some sense, leaning towards idiocy, or indicative of idiocy. For the record, this is not entirely new either. It's a key part of why Prince Mishkin is judged by the other characters to be an idiot in Dostoevsky's novel of that name. But just because something like this has precedence doesn't mean it's not a problem, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least try to shift our attitudes here. The trouble with vulnerability being almost demonized in this way is that building any kind of strong, reliable interpersonal connection with someone involves being vulnerable. Risk is just inherent to the game here. Sometimes this is in the form of trust, like confiding a secret in them. Sometimes it's in the form of opening yourself up to being hurt by them, as happens when you fall in love. Sometimes it's just in believing that they don't mean you active harm, and so allowing yourself to be relaxed in their presence. In each case, these things are inseparable from a certain kind of vulnerability. And when we condemn people who make this gamble and fail, we are effectively disincentivizing other people from taking that chance. At the extreme end, this can manifest in us equating perverse cynicism with wisdom. When we think that to be trusting or to be vulnerable is to be foolish, we can begin to glorify the person who trusts no one, never builds any strong attachments, and never forms any close relationships. But is that the kind of life that would actually make us happy and fulfilled? I'm willing to admit, maybe for some people, but for the majority, I would wager this would be a rather lonely and unfulfilling existence. Moreover, I dread to think of the effect that such an extreme general cynicism would have on our societies more generally. Having stable communities requires that we build up mutual trust, and by looking down on those who make themselves vulnerable, we are robbing ourselves of the tools we need to do this. At the very least, we are incentivizing a way of life which, if replicated at scale, would be a total disaster. Of course, on the face of it, this is quite difficult to reconcile with what we're told, which is that we're moving towards a more enlightened age, where people do feel like they can be vulnerable. And it's possible that I've just missed something, but I see little concrete evidence that this is true. I think we certainly say we're okay with vulnerability an awful lot, but when the chips are down, I'm not convinced that we often follow through on this thought. I imagine that this probably has a lot to do with the decline in the number of close friends that we've seen in the past few decades. These are the people that, in theory, are more likely to have patience for our vulnerability and irrationality rather than mock us when things go wrong. But either way, I don't really see our widespread norms around this kind of vulnerability changing all that much. I still see people who are hurt in romantic pursuits branded as childish, and I still see people called fools when they trust someone and get screwed over, as happens to all of us sometimes. I think that, at best, this newfound loud appreciation for vulnerability is limited to a few particular behaviors, like crying. And at worst, I just think it's an exercise in wishful thinking. I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that we should all become blubbering messes all the time, letting our emotions run wild. But I am somewhat concerned with an approach to life that makes some really deeply motivating feelings a source of embarrassment, and one that confuses blanket cynicism for careful wisdom. As we mentioned in the last section, what we have now in our approach to love is a contradiction at the heart of our value system. Love is venerated, but at the same time, in practice, it's often considered embarrassing. Its positive attributes are idealized into a quasi-spiritual state, while its more chaotic or naturalistic sides are condemned as either not real love or are just avoided outright. This idealization does, I think, make a lot of sense in context, because it resolves the contradiction. It creates a kind of theoretical, heavenly love that is totally devoid of unpleasantness and that doesn't demand any sacrifice of independence or real vulnerability. It wouldn't really be vulnerable to be in this kind of perfect love because, by hypothesis, there is no chance of getting hurt. It is vulnerable, however, to engage in love as it shows up in the world, with all of its messy and paradoxical and chaotic and embarrassing aspects. While raising love to the standard of a perfect ideal initially seems like it's glorifying it, upon closer inspection, it's diminishing love as it actually exists and replacing it with a spectre. It's almost like Nietzsche's ascetic ideal, but in the domain of love. Rather than face up to the highs and lows of naturalistic love in this world, we instead place our hopes in a sort of otherworldly love. Just as Nietzsche argued, we use the ascetic ideal to escape and ultimately justify the sufferings of our existence by retreating into a higher plane, often in the form of heaven, but also in the form of the Platonic realm and things like that. But in both cases, we end up denigrating the thing that exists in our experience. We treat love as embarrassing, partly because we have exiled our non-embarrassing love to the celestial plane. So, what's the way forward here? Well, I don't think there are any easy answers, and as I said, it is very tempting to think we must leap to the other extreme and begin venerating emotional outbursts and emotional vulnerability in all cases. Ideally, I would hope that we would learn to steer a path between over-romanticism on the one hand and outright anti-romanticism on the other. There are many parts of life, I might even say most parts, where calm, independence, and unbroken rationality are excellent things. I would be immensely worried, for example, if we started setting government policy based on the love affairs of our politicians. But what's excellent in one context may be detrimental in another. And I fear that the totalizing nature of our independence obsession will continue to make much of love embarrassing, simply because passionate love as we feel it often won't fit into this mold. In an otherwise quite naturalistic age, we're rather hesitant towards any kind of naturalism about love, or about this independence obsession that we've cultivated. I think it's time to seriously ask whether either of these ideals are attainable in their totalizing forms, and, if not, whether we might want to consider shifting them slightly. That doesn't mean that we should all become emotionally incontinent, but it does mean that if we do want love to stop being so embarrassing, we're going to have to carve out a little piece of tolerance for irrationality, vulnerability, and paradox in that particular sphere, even if we wouldn't tolerate it in other spheres. And although it's a bit less extreme, we might also consider doing this for some other forms of interpersonal risk, such as trust or care. But this is easy to say and hard to actually do. It's all very well proclaiming that such irrationality and vulnerability is often part of the deal in many people's experience of love, and that we shouldn't be surprised by it nor shame it. But are we prepared for when people actually publicly behave in accordance with this? Are we ready for our friend to call us up, lovesick and temporarily insane, and babble on about their beloved? Are we ready for people to talk about love with all of its messy and indecent parts, rather than the idealized spook that we've created in its place? Are we ready to hold back our own condemnation when someone trusts quickly, or is made a fool of, or temporarily seems blind to reason? Or, like many of us do today, are we going to pay a brief lip service to these things before going right back to considering them shameful and embarrassing. Maybe I'm a pessimist, but I sort of suspect that it's the latter. Ideals are difficult to shift, even when we're self-consciously trying to shift them in ourselves, and the current ones have the benefit of inertia on their side. But so long as these ideals remain, love, outside of an idealized box, will remain quite embarrassing. And to that extent, we'll be unable to live one of life's most profound and interesting experiences without an underlying shame. So what I'm really saying is, I think we should get ready for these observations about love's embarrassment to be repeated again and again in slightly different forms across a million poems, articles, and novels in the decades to come. And when they do, at least we can reflect upon the grand history of love's embarrassments, and at least smile at how we rediscover the same truths again and again with each passing generation. Perhaps, when we are inevitably embarrassed by our own loves, we can consider that we are not alone. But if you want to learn more about the irrational and insane aspects to love, you can check out my full video on Dorothy Tenov's book, Love and Limerence, right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.